Welcome to Rooting for You, a seasonal gardening podcast for non-experts. I'm Tess, and I know nothing.
And I'm Alyce, and I know some things.
Each week we'll chat about one gardening topic and then discuss the effort-reward payoff by asking, is the juice worth the squeeze? Just a heads up, there might be a bit of swearing in this episode. You've been warned. Welcome to Tess's composting adventures. You'll probably be aware from episode 4 that I was just setting up my home composting solution. So much has happened since we recorded that episode. Firstly, Alyce, and she'll be the first to admit that composting is one of her passions, has been losing sleep over all the things she forgot to say. Second, so many people have asked me composting questions that frankly I can't answer. And finally, and most importantly, I have pulled the trigger on my home composting solution. What I have gone with is something that we spoke about a little bit on the episode of I have my standalone bin, which I'm using for garden waste and cardboard. I'm not putting any food scraps in there because I'd worry about rodents. And then I went out and purchased 2 worm buffets, and I have one in each of my raised garden beds. What a worm buffet is, for those who haven't seen a picture, is it's like a black plastic receptacle that doesn't have a bottom, and you dig it into the garden bed, and then it's got little holes in it that worms can go in and out of. And then the last thing that I've been thinking about is possibly also getting a worm farm, because I'm worried that my pot plants and my indoor pots are missing out on the worm tea. As a brief aside, someone told me that it's also called worm wee, but we absolutely will not be rolling with that term as an option on this podcast.
Oh, you don't love that, Tess?
I do not. So that was probably too of a high gloss over of my worm buffet, but I'm loving it.
You are my composting protege. I am just, as discussed in the previous episode, I just can't get enough of composting. I really think composting is saving the world, and the fact that Tess has thrown herself with gusto, and frankly, like you've committed a lot, but at the same time, I don't think it's been a massive, you haven't spent your whole weekend sorting this stuff out, I don't think.
No. So, I'll summarise it.
Please.
At the nursery or the hardware store where I got the worm buffet, there were heaps of options, and they were really helpful with sort of chatting through. A bit of them I was actually leaning towards worm farm before I went in there, but then swayed for all of the reasons that you said. One that is great about a worm buffet is that the worms can go in and out. You don't need to worry so much about worrying for the worm welfare, because if they are not getting what they want from inside the buffet, they can just wriggle out and find something else to eat.
And conversely, they're actually doing the work, taking the nutrients from the worm buffet in the garden and actually distributing it throughout your garden bed. So it actually saves you time because the worms do the work for you. So I think they're a brilliant setup, whether it's the actual worm buffet that you purchased or like I've got like a DIY version in my garden. I don't even know if you've seen this, Tess, but I've got like plumber's downpipes with holes drilled in them that stick into my raised garden beds, and then I put food scraps into those, and then the worms go into those, eat the food scraps, come out into my raised beds and poo and wee effectively.
Yeah, it's exactly the same concept. So.
It is, yeah. So, I mean, look, the fact that someone's made it for you, like,
it's handy. It's
bloody brilliant. If you're handy yourself, get some pipes and do it. But it's the same principle, and I do think it is. Maybe it's the best because, as you say, the worm welfare is taken care of, and the movement of nutrients is taken care of.
I think they all have pros and cons.
Oh, here we go. Switzerland over there. The biggest con I can think of, which I'll be interested to see if you see this, is that it actually don't hold very much.
Oh gosh, that's my first question. Hang on, I've got
okay.
so many questions. Firstly, on your downpipes, how do you? Because on my worm buffet, the lid like clicks in and seals so that it keeps rodents out or whatever. How are you sealing your
So I have
down
caps
pipes
on the tops of my down
Oh,
pipes.
okay.
Like caps you get from the plumbing store.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know what plumbers use them for, but they're like perfectly fit.
I guess they use them to keep water in.
I suppose. So I think a plumber would usually like glue those in. And so I obviously don't glue them in. I just have them like sitting on top of the
Okay.
pipe. So I just lift the cap off, chuck my food in, put the cap on.
And how deep is it in the soil / how high is it above the soil?
It's probably half a metre below the soil, half a metre above the soil.
Okay. That sounds quite easy to get in, because I'll tell you something about the worm buffet. Digging the hole, and admittedly of the 2 that I've put in, I only dug one of the holes myself. It was a bit of effort.
I did warn in the last episode that was the prick. Any of these in-ground composting systems, like my Green Revolution compost, whatever it is, they're great, but getting them in is such an effort. It's a big hole.
That's gone now. I mean, that's done. That's in.
And you'll never do it again.
Key question. What do you do about overfilling it? How do you not overfill it? How much is too full?
Yeah, I mean, it's the biggest problem. So the thing I'll say about my plumber pipes, and I think yours has got a bigger mouth on it, but when you think about a down pipe, like it's all good and well if you're putting an apple core in there, but when you're like got a bowl of compost that you're trying to funnel into a down pipe, it's actually a real problem.
Sounds quite painful.
So I often save, I don't know, if I've got some kind of like small dose compost, it goes into my tubes, my equivalent of the worm buffet. For any like big bowl of compost, I don't bother putting it in there. You can fill it up until it's full, and even if it's sticking out of the ground with compost in it, that's totally fine. Like with my half a metre above the ground, I can fill that up with food scraps, no worries, and that'll just kind of funnel down as the stuff in the bottom's eaten. As long as you can get the lid on it, it's fine. If you can't get the lid on, that's going to be a real problem.
Mm-hmm.
So, but you'll probably find that you're going to have more food scraps than just this. So they're brilliant options, but you need a secondary option, or a second compost solution.
So I bought new worms, and I added this in the Instagram post because I don't think that we spoke about it, but so important when you're buying live worms, just to open up the box and just have a look, because you don't know how long the box has been sitting on the shelf for, and obviously it's a live creature that you're buying. So when I was chatting to someone, they were like, oh, you won't see worms, but like, take it from Alyce and I, you should 100% see worms. So open it up, look if you can see worms before you buy it.
Yeah.
Because you should.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the problem is like they're sitting on the shelf like, a spade does. A spade is not alive. As Tess said, you want to make sure those worms are alive. You should see a gutload of worms the second you open that box. If you don't, put it back, get another one.
So this episode's going to be a little bit different, and then I'm just going to hit you with questions because things that have popped into my mind as I've been doing this. So I'm in my kitchen preparing all my food. I've got my scraps that I'm just putting into a little bowl at the moment. Do I need to chop them up?
Yeah, good question. So the smaller the food scraps are, the faster they will decompose. If that's because they're in a worm farm, the faster the worms will eat them. If that's in a compost bin, the faster that will break down through the wild worms and the microorganisms, etc. So I would say in a big compost bin, that's not so much of a big deal, but in a small compost bin or a worm farm, absolutely, I would chop up those scraps quite small. Now, if you've got any kind of high-powered blender, any kind of Thermomix or thermocooker, as some of this audience may do, you can put your food scraps in that and actually turbo it. And
That's so good. I hadn't thought about doing that. That's genius.
Brilliant. And your worms will love you for it. The smaller the particle, it's like, think about, we're all lazy, right? Worms, humans, everyone combined. So if you can puree the food scraps for the worms, they can actually eat it a lot faster because you've done half like the masticating process for them. So they'll eat it faster, which is brilliant because we want them to process as much food scraps as possible. So yeah, I mean, chop it up small. blend it up small if you can. I mean, I don't want someone standing in the kitchen being like, oh, dinner's over, I got to go chop up my food scraps. Like, no, don't be ridiculous about it. But I mean, yeah, if you can just put a couple of big chops through the pile just to break it down a little bit, it's going to go a long way.
Something that I've heard a lot of people talk about, but I need you to break it down a little bit for me. Break it down, is this green-brown ratio.
Yeah. So we touched on this briefly last time. It's the green is wet stuff. So your banana peels, your celery tops, your brown...
So all kitchen waste, like cooking waste.
All cooking waste, yeah. All food scraps would be green. And then brown is your dried matter. So that is your cardboard, your bills, as discussed last time. Paper towel, if you've used in the kitchen to wipe up a spill, you can put that in. Newspapers.
Fallen leaves? Would they be dry?
Fallen leaves.
What's it, brown or green?
Yeah, brown.
Okay.
They'll be brown. And they're a really good brown, actually. They're an easy one to get. They're free. So with the ratio, it's not like I can say, okay, you go 40% green and 60% brown. What it is you just need to load your compost in there, having consciousness of having both elements. But really, when I put my compost in, I don't think about that. What I do is I look at my compost, I smell my compost, and then from that, I can kind of get a gauge as to whether it needs more wet or more dry. People talk about it in terms of green and brown. I think just wet and dry is an easier way.
Yeah, it's kind of easier.
Yeah.
What you mentioned smells.
Yeah.
What should your compost smell like?
Well, the thing is, it shouldn't smell. Like, if it has a really strong odor, that's a problem.
So we're looking out for funky smells.
Yeah, exactly. In the same way, if you stick your nose in your soil in the garden, like, it doesn't smell like anything. Like, it really shouldn't smell. If it's got an offensive odor, any kind of funky odor, if it's hitting you with a smell, my money is on the fact it's too wet and it doesn't have enough oxygen for the microbes to do their work. That would be almost a guarantee that's your problem. In which case, too wet means we need to add more dry. Get those autumn leaves piled in there, get a newspaper, tear it up, throw it in there, get some dry material that'll soak up some of the moisture and it will return the compost to its happy medium between the two. So if it's too dry, I would say it kind of looks crumbly, like almost like a pile of autumn leaves. Like if you've got like identifiable food scraps hanging out like as a dry mix, it's too dry. Two options there. Add some wet. So if you had some kitchen scraps, add those in. But also you can just get a watering can and just water the thing and add moisture that way. Super simple.
Which is fine for the in-ground options like the worm buffet, but you need to, if you've got a worm farm, you need to be careful not to drown them.
Yes, you do. And I do have some tips for not drowning your worms in the worm farm, but I reckon we'll just hold horses on that for a sec because it's a bit of a discussion. So yeah, give it a water if it's too dry. If it's too wet, the thing that's probably going to give that away is the smell. Secondarily, if your compost is like a rotating unit and it's like dripping out liquid, that Tessa's face just then, hilarious. Yeah, it's gross. Shouldn't be doing that. Anything gross about a compost is usually...
Something's not right.
Exactly. So if it's dripping out water, that's going to be a problem. I think that's probably your two things, the smell and the dripping, in which case add dry ingredients, bring it back to its happy medium, and it'll be fine. Now, if you're always adding in wet ingredients, always adding in dry ingredients, you are going to get to the point, like it's going to be a problem. So have a consciousness about it. But generally speaking, I find that kind of what's going on in life, it seems to just naturally work its way. If it needs a little tweak in either direction, it's not... I don't want people to get super hung up on this wet-dry situation.
I'm not an expert, I'm not going to toot my own horn, but what I have done, and I'm interested to know whether you think it's as good an idea as I obviously think it is, but where I've like had a cardboard box, like a big one, I've torn it up into little bits and I've have a bucket of it in the shed so that I can, if I'm just doing kitchen waste, and I've got that on hand to add in some...
Tess, literally, you're writing the book on composting. People often say composting tip 101 is have a bucket next to the compost bin of something dry to add, because usually that is going to be the problem, that you're going to want to add some dry ingredients. So, you know, a bucket of autumn leaves, some cardboard ripped up and newspaper shredded up, any of these things, absolutely brilliant for just chucking in when you're loading in those food scraps. So you're a natural.
The other thing that I spend a lot of time thinking about, particularly during meal prep, is wondering about my worms and what they like to eat. If I'm grating a beetroot, I'm like, is this a delicious treat for them? So do you know what? I mean, I know what they don't like. They don't like citrus.
Yes, they don't like citrus.
They don't like garlic, onion.
Yeah.
What do they like? What's a treat?
Well, good question. I don't know what the worm equivalent of ice cream is, but I mean, variety is always good. Honestly, as long as it doesn't include those 3 like devil ingredients, it's fine. What I will say though is that they do tend to have favorites, and I don't know what they are though, but you do notice that something gets eaten first in the pile. I'm going to pay attention now and come back to you with the worm equivalent of ice cream. But by chopping it up small or pureeing it up, it's kind of like you've got a kid who's got like ice cream and green beans on the plate, and like they're going to eat the ice cream first. But if you pureed the green beans into the ice cream,
they're forced to eat them.
They're just going to have to eat the lot, you know? So if we puree it up, it's the best way to get them to eat the most of it.
So, confession time. You can tell me whether this is a bad idea of things to do.
So far, you're like 3 for 3.
Because I'm so obsessed with my worms. I like to see them and to know that they're there still wiggling around. So I bought myself some heavy duty gloves just from the supermarket, and we might cut this bit out. I'll occasionally just like have a little dig in just to see whether they're still there wiggling around. Am I upsetting them by doing that?
I mean, do you want someone sticking your finger in your home?
Oh, no. Okay, stop doing that.
No, I mean, I don't think the worms are going to hold it against you, honestly. I don't think they're going to care. I think it is important to know that you do have a thriving worm population. And if you can put your hands in and grab a handful and see heaps of worms, then you know you've got a thriving worm population. So you know what you're doing is working. Because, I mean, if what you're doing isn't working, there will be no worms. So if they're there, and as I've said before, they are sensitive little souls, if they are still there, you're nailing it. Do you need to stick your hands in like Tess has done to assess whether the worms are there in big populations? You actually don't. If you're adding food scraps to your worm farm and they are disappearing, unless you've got some hole that a rat is getting in, I can tell you the worms are there in thriving populations and they are consuming that food.
We spoke about the rotating compost bins, which I'll come back to because I've got another question on these, but just while we're talking about me and my composting solutions, just double checking, we don't need to, for the worm buffet that sits in the ground and has worms that can go in and out, we don't need to aerate that because the worms aerate themselves.
Exactly. Any composting system that relies on worms, whether it be introduced worms in the form of like a box of worms or whether it's wild worms, that the worms are doing the aeration for us because they wriggle through the earth, creating little micro pathways and channels, and that oxygenates the soil, oxygenates the compost. So lo and behold, anytime you have a worm, it's doing part of the job for you. So it's less work you need to do, which is why with the rotating compost bins, I'm a bit hesitant about these kind of composting solutions. I mean, look, if that works for you, brilliant, go for it. But because we don't have worms working for us, we need to work harder and we need to do the rotation, the gyration, we need to do the aeration. So anytime it's a closed system without worms, aeration is going to be a factor. I don't say difficult, but it's going to be integral to the solution. By getting those worms in there, they're doing it for us. In the same way, we will never need to rotate a worm farm, ever. Oxygenation, as long as you haven't drowned them, they will have the oxygenation nailed.
That's all my questions that I had on my worm buffet. Was there anything else you wanted to mention on worm buffets before we talk about the standalone options?
No, I think that's covered, and I think most gardens could really benefit from one. But as I said, I don't think it's going to be your only composting solution. But relying on the worms to aerate and then relying on the worms to distribute nutrients, like
gold.
Gold. You feed them, they work for you. That is not nailing the garden. I don't know what is.
So on my standalone that I'm putting in garden waste and cardboard, I get that all the same principles apply. Do I need to worry about aerating that? Because it is open bottom, so I'm hoping worms can get in there. But I can't imagine if I'm a worm and I'm looking at the worm buffet that's getting delicious kitchen waste put in it, why would a worm go into my standalone one?
Good question, but I think you'll find they will.
Okay.
I mean, there's only so many worms that can eat in the worm buffet, so others are going to have to eat at the other restaurant. The one reason why you might not get worms in your standalone, anyone might not, is if you haven't got it moist enough. Standalones can actually sometimes become too dry.
Okay, so you could just
give it a water.
Your watering can or your hose in there.
Yeah, just get your watering can in. If you, and again, I wouldn't say you should do this right now, Tess, but like when we're a bit further down the process, you can open that little side hatch and stick your hand in there and you should get a nice handful of worms.
Okay.
Okay, so the aeration question is a good one here. Opinions differ, and someone's going to listen to this and have a different opinion than me, but we're going to run with this.
We welcome opinions as well.
Yeah, exactly. And if it works for you, it works for you. I don't ever aerate my standalone compost bins. I let the worms do it. Will my compost be slower to compost because of it? Yes, I'm certain. If I aerated them, and you can actually buy this thing that looks like a corkscrew and put it in the top of your composter and turn it like a corkscrew, and that'll actually aerate your compost. If you want your compost to go faster, because a lot of the time you do because you actually want to use it. Secondarily, if you find for whatever reason you've got your wet and dry mixture working perfectly, everything's kind of ticking boxes but it's not moving, get an aerator and aerate it.
Okay.
But I find as long as you keep the compost the right moisture level to attract a worm, because again, if it's too wet, they're going to go away, and if it's too dry, they're going to go away. But if I keep the moisture levels right, I always have worms in there and they do the aeration for me. How I know it's working is because I literally have compost from food scraps, but secondarily, when I look in that hatch, it is like worm lasagna. It is just layer upon layer upon layer of worm.
Okay.
So they're doing the job for me. So some would say it's essential. I would say if you can get away with not doing it, don't bother. If you need to do it, get the aerator in there. You don't need to use a fancy corkscrew aerator. You can just get like a pitchfork and just, give it a fold.
Yeah,
give it a
right.
toss.
So what other things might I need to be worried about or thinking about with ongoing care for my standalone? Is it just really the ratio and making sure happy ratio?
It's as simple as that. It's really just about the ratio. If you want to speed it up, and again, you might well want to because this compost is gold, the bigger the pile, the faster it will compost.
Oh, I wouldn't have, that seems counterintuitive.
It does a bit because it actually creates it hits a critical mass and then heats up. So have you ever, like you've walked past a big pile of mulch and you can actually feel it's got heat radiating off it? It's the same with a compost bin. So a smaller amount of compost can't generate that heat, and the warmer it is, the faster it composts. Now, if we've got any kombucha or sourdough enthusiasts amongst us, like me, you'll know that in summer your sourdough rises faster, your kombucha ferments faster. Anytime we're relying on microbes to do work, heat will speed up the process. So I would say if that's a factor, try and get it up to 1 metre cubed. That's kind of the minimum size to get that really good warmth up. So, you can go around and collect autumn leaves and kind of collect compost from around the place if you want to really build up your compost. The other thing is the smaller the pieces in there, the faster it will compost. The same with the worms. Now, because this compost bin for you, Tess, has garden waste and things like that, we're not talking about like chopping up your food scraps tiny here. But say when you pulled out your tomatoes, they might be one big plant. If you shove that whole big plant into the compost bin, that's going to take a lot longer than if you get the secateurs and kind of roughly chop it down. So that would be, I think, a key part is just getting it into slightly smaller pieces. Also with things like newspapers, don't chuck in an entire newspaper. That's not going to work. Shred it up. Like rip it. Like you don't need to get your commercial shredder onto it, but just like rip it into like pages and then kind of just make it easier for the process. That would be my biggest advice with the troubleshooting of the standalone compost bin. And something I would really like to say that I should have said in the previous episode is, remember when I said with the big bin, you said to me, how do we get the compost out of it? Because this is a key factor, right? We've made this compost, but then how do we access it? I said I lift up the whole bin and shovel all the compost. Now, the thing that I really need to stress here is that if you've only got one compost bin, that solution is not going to work for you because you'll have last night's dinner scraps on the top of it that have not composted down yet. So if you've only got one compost bin, you're going to need to use that hatch at the bottom and scoop out the stuff at the bottom, because the bottom stuff will be perfectly composted. The top will have the fresher scraps on it. What I do is I have 2 of these bins. I actually have 4, but ignore that. For all intents and purposes, you just need 2. And what I do is I fill up one with my food scraps. Not food scraps, sorry. We're not putting food scraps in this one, just garden scraps. Fill that up to the top. And once it's at the top, I stop using it. I start using the second one. I ignore the first one for a couple of months. Then I come back and that's perfectly composted down. Then I lift the whole unit up, shovel it out and start filling up that one. So you constantly swap between the 2 compost bins.
So if I know that spring is coming up and I'm going to replenish my soil nutrients in spring.
Excellent.
And I and I have a look in the hole at, I don't know, let me know how far out, and it doesn't look like it's going very quickly. Are there things that I can do to speed up the process, because I know in 4 weeks or 6 weeks or however long that I'm going to, I have it scheduled that weekend that I'm going to be doing my soil nutrients revamp?
Well, once you've got the stuff in there, other than increasing the size, there's not much you can do. And the aeration. Aeration. That would be the 2.
And grab from the bottom.
Grab from the bottom. Yeah. And look, that's why they make them with that trap door. I mean, they're not expecting people to have multiples like I do. They are expecting people to scoop out from the trap door. I just find that you can't get as much out from the trap door as what's even in there that's actually ready to be used. So if you've got the space for 2, go for it. If not, scoop from the bottom, let the older stuff, take the older stuff out, let the newer kitchen waste and garden waste fall down to the bottom, and you keep adding on top. It's like a circle.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, good.
We have a couple of audience questions.
Oh, here we go. Hit me.
The first one is, on worm farms, how do you keep them thriving throughout the whole farming and harvesting process?
Okay. I'm glad someone's asked this, because the worm farms do need a little bit of care, different and on top of the old compost bin, wet and dry. So firstly, we don't want our worms to dry out. As discussed, they will die. So you want to keep your worm farm moist at all times. This is essential. But as we've flagged, you can drown your worms. The way you stop this from happening is all worm farms, unless they're like your worm buffet, which are open anyway, will have a tap on them. Keep this tap open at all times.
Okay.
This is essential. Get a bucket, keep it underneath the tap. So if the tap starts draining out, you've got a bucket to capture that worm tea or worm pee. So what you would do is you water it. The worm farm will suck up all the moisture it needs. A little bit of water will stay in the bottom, and this will kind of keep it moist over the following days, weeks, and then any excess water will drain out. If you have the tap closed, that's when you can drown the worms. If the tap is open, you can never drown the worms.
I was so worried about the worms drowning last time we spoke, and this seems like it's a really simple solution.
It is a really simple solution, and I'm disappointed I didn't mention it last time, because it is so fundamental, but it's not something that people know, and that's key. And the thing is that liquid coming out is gold for your garden, so that's why we always want to have a bucket kept underneath, so anything that does drain out is captured by the bucket ready for the garden. So that's how you keep the moisture right. And I'm going to say on average, if it's super hot or super cold, this will be different, but I'm saying you're going to need to water your worms once a week.
Okay.
Watering can full of water and just pour it over your worms. You don't want to keep your worms in the full sun. In fact, you want no sun. I want full shade. I want dark, garage, shed. Okay? Because, you think it's a black plastic bin, effectively. That is going to heat up big time, and we don't want to cook our little
slow cooked worms.
No, that's terrible. So in a dark place, darker the better. Now, we've discussed this. Smaller food particles, the faster the worms will consume, the more they'll get through, the bigger their population will grow, which is what we want. You should see over time that your worm population is growing and that you can feed them more often, larger amounts, and they'll actually get through it. If you are feeding them the same amount you've always fed them and they're not getting through it, I would say your worm population is declining and there might be something wrong with your worm farm or with your worm process. You should be able to at least feed them the same that you always have, probably feed them more as their populations build up. They are sensitive little souls, as discussed, and they don't like moldy food. So don't wait until your food scraps are moldy to put them in the worm farm. Give it to them fresh.
All composting solutions don't like mold, or just in the worm farm because they're delicate souls?
Ideally, we'll keep mold out of all systems, but worms, delicate souls won't take the mold. The compost bin will totally handle that mold.
Okay.
So if you've let your food scraps sit there for a few days and they have gone moldy, and I've been guilty of this many times, bypass the worms and just chuck it straight in the compost bin. Even if, you've got a no food scraps policy, one little bucket of moldy stuff isn't gonna break the whole system.
Yeah, but it's also just on the flip side of it, just make sure you take it out before it gets too moldy.
Yeah, just do it.
Keep an eye out.
And feed them more often, smaller amounts. So not like one massive dump of food. If you can, the more regularly you can do it. I mean, even if you did it every day, that would be brilliant. You don't need to, but yeah, the smaller amounts more often the better. A lot of worm farms come with a blanket on top, like it's like a Hessian sack piece. These are really good at regulating the moisture and keeping the temperature and everything in the worm farm perfect. So if yours doesn't come with, I think it's called a blanket. It kind of looks like a little blanket. Buy one from any hardware store, any nursery.
Crucial for summer and winter?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. It will regulate the temperature and the moisture all year round. Now, this lovely person who's asked the question, which is my very long response, the harvesting. So most of a worm farm harvest is going to come from the tea or the wee that will pee out the tap.
It's tea. We're sticking with
tea. Okay, we're running with tea. So that's going to be how you harvest most of the goodness. But you will get to a point where it's actually going to be full and you can't add any more food scraps because you have like a totally full worm farm. In this case, get your shovel, get a little bucket and scoop out some of the compost. It will look just like compost in a compost bin. It'll look just like soil. It will have heaps of worms in it. Brilliant. They can now go and live in the garden. Don't worry about the fact that you're removing worms from the system. If your worm farm is strong enough that you have filled up the entire bin, you have enough of a worm population that you can happily scoop some out and what is left will regenerate no problem at all. And then add that to your garden beds the same way you would any other compost.
I've seen some worm farms that have levels.
Yes.
How do they
I have
work?
one of those. So the idea with that is that by adding the levels on when the compost fills up, instead of having to harvest it, we can just create a bigger worm farm. So it's like we're adding a story to the house as we have more kids. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I actually quite like this. I almost never harvest from my worm farm the actual compost soil part. I only harvest the tea because as far as I'm concerned, the bigger the population we can build in that worm farm, the more food scraps it's going to get through and the better that is for me. So I would actually prefer a bigger worm farm with a bigger population and I'll just use compost from my regular compost bin for the garden beds. So The levels are great as a way to expand it. And then, look, you can, once you then reach, they've usually got 3 levels. Once you reach the 3rd level and that's full, you can take the bottom level off, empty that into the garden, and then put it back on the top. Mm-hmm. So again, it's this like circular system.
Yeah. Seems to make it a bit easier.
It does, yeah. It is. It is really simple. And, you know, like I said in the last episode, you don't need fancy stuff to compost or to have a worm farm. But at the same time, a well-designed unit does make your life easier. And that's a benefit. Mm. So the only other thing here I'll say on worm farms is if all is going to plan and your worms are happy, once you've bought that box of worms all those years ago, or in your case, a week ago, you will never need to buy more worms. So I bought a box of worms, 8-10 years ago from my worm farm, and I have one of those 3-level ones with the tap. I have never bought more worms. They will continue to populate, make babies, lay eggs in the case of worms, hatch. They will continue growing. So I don't want you to think that this is an expense that you're going to have to incur every season to purchase more worms. If they die, if you stuff something up, don't beat yourself up, buy another box, but that shouldn't be kind of the ongoing maintenance plan of your worm farm, to be topping it up. You should get them thriving, that they will build up their own population.
Yeah, and if you are finding that you are needing to buy a box every season, maybe you're doing something wrong with...
Yeah, I would say...
Look into it more?
Yeah. I'd say, look, people are going to stuff this up when they're learning. If you stuff it up once and you buy another box, I would say learn from that, get on with it, don't worry. If, as you say, you're needing to buy a new box every season, we've got a problem. And it's probably going to be the moisture issue.
We have...
Crapped on forever.
So long.
So long.
We're going to... Look, no doubt we'll come back to this again and again and again, because it is one of your favourite topics to talk about.
As I said, saving the world one bucket of compost at a time.
And I am becoming increasingly more obsessed with my composting. At least it's like my job here is done.
Literally. I don't even think we need a squeezy juice.
No, we've already done that. We know it's fantastic.
We're on it.
We're on it. I've done the hard work now, so I'm feeling pretty chuffed with myself, like a little bit like a superstar.
I reckon. And look, if you have more composting questions, because I dare say we kind of covered everything, get on Instagram at rootingforyoupod and tell us what your composting questions are.
Rooting For You is hosted by Alyce and Tess. You can find us on Instagram at rootingforyoupod or email rootingforyou@alycealexandra.com.